I'm just started the recording, and maybe let's start with a brief introduction of ourselves, and then I'll flip to the page where you can see the list of participants who have agreed to participate. So, Alex, why don't you introduce yourself just briefly, and we'll just go through the list as it's appearing on my screen.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or evening, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Alex Casillas. I'm a principal research psychologist at ACT. We're primarily known as a testing company, but we do a lot of other different things. And we've developed something that is called a holistic framework, of which includes a number of the knowledge and skills that are needed to be successful in education, in the workplace, and of course, and in life. So I think that this is why I was asked to be part of this.
Great, thank you, Alex. Oki?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. What was the question?
Just introducing yourselves briefly, just to say hello, and we'll...
Yeah, no worries. My name is Aukje de Kaat. I work for Aflatoon International, and we work on life skills and financial education materials that we implement and use with approximately 200 partners in over 100 countries, and I manage the research department. Hi, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Oki. Jonathan?
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Jonathan Bagley. I'm CEO of the PSHE Association, which is from the UK. It's the national body for personal, social health and economic education, which is the bit of the curriculum here that we deliver a whole range of health education, drug education, sex and relationships education, and also covering things like economic literacy as well. So we represent teachers and schools and devise the curriculum for them as well.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Margaret, if you click on your mic and just introduce yourself briefly. Margaret, if you're having trouble with your microphone, perhaps you could use the instant message box at the lower left-hand corner of the screen and just say hello and introduce yourself as well. You need to turn on your mic in order to be heard. It's usually in the bottom of the screen with the little microphone. There should be a bar across it, and when you click on it, it should open up. Martin, are you on? I see you on the list. Martin Henry from Education International. Do you just want to click on your mic and say hello as well? Yeah. I'm seeing. Yep, great, Martin.
Yeah. Hi, Doug. Martin Henry here from Education International. We're an international teachers union organisation. We represent 33 million teachers, about 179 countries, about 400 affiliates. And we've been working with Doug in this area for a number of years. We really support the opening up of curriculum from a narrow focus on literacy and numeracy to a more holistic focus on the whole child. We look forward to positioning teachers in the work in a way that's going to be useful for them and useful for the students. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Elizabeth, do you want to just say hello and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. This is Elizabeth Shuey. I'm an analyst in the Education and Skills Directorate at the OECD. I work on a few projects that are relevant to this group, but probably most importantly, we're launching a new project on social and emotional skills with 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds. And then I'm also working a little bit on the early childhood goals, meeting the SDGs around that, so 4.2.1, as well as doing some work on Indigenous student education.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Yuka, do you want to click on your mic and say hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this is Yuka from WHO Health Promotion Unit. So with regard to life skill and then like a health literacy issue, we are working on the development of the package of the life skill education for enhancing health literacy in every school to prevent non-communicable disease. So now we're working for the development package, then focus on life skill educations. So this will be a very great opportunity to work with you.
Great, thank you, Yuka. And I'm just going to hopefully go to the right page on, hopefully you're now seeing the list of members of the working group that have agreed to participate. It's a lot longer than we've been able to attract to this particular meeting. And that's actually why we're trying to go to a series of meetings that are geared around people's busy schedules. But we've been really pleased. I hope you're seeing there's at least 25 names there, and we have another 15 or so that I couldn't put on this on the screen late last night. So it's really been very positive to have this number of people interested in participating. And there are several members of the FRESH partnership who are on that list who will be helping guide the entire project. So I'm going to I think I'm going to leave in this format. I've managed to confuse myself about how to manage both the slides and the seeing the screen as well. But I just wanted to briefly, in these few slides, just go through a couple of important things about the project, and then stop at different points to ask for comments or discussion. As well, we've asked everybody to send in comments or suggestions by email. We'll collate them and revise the work plan and any other considerations as we move forward. But just if you can see the second slide, which is the reality and challenge that has been ignored, what we're trying to do, I'm not going to go through the slide entirely, but is to really start from a different vantage point in looking at health and personal and social development education, which is a catch-all title I've been using to capture the many different interpretations of life skills and health literacy and social inclusion and social development and so on. There are many different strands of it that need to be addressed, but basically trying to look at a capacity-based approach where we look at starting with what does exist and what is feasible for school systems in 3 different contexts to be able to address. And part of the problem is that most of the research and most of the work in health and social issues has been always on a issue-by-issue basis, and often the programs and the research look at optimal levels of learning in regard to that issue or topic, and so we have very many different competing issues and very many different competing paradigms all trying to get into the same space within the school day. And so that's the challenge that we're trying to address in this project. It's a bit of a inverse approach that we may find challenging as we work through it. And so one of the important points that the FRESH partners in their FRESH framework make clear in the very outset is that countries and jurisdictions need to make choices about which topics they need to address. And so that's the very important piece that needs to be understood at the beginning, is that we're not trying to look at all topics in one country, but trying to help that country make choices about which topics are more relevant, or countries in general, which topics are more relevant, and then be able to offer minimum hypotheses about what can be hypotheses for minimum learning outcomes or outputs for those particular types of programs in that particular context. I'm looking at the slide entitled "Different Context and Different Curricula." One starting point again is that we're trying to look at things in 3 different types of context: high resource countries, low resource countries, and conflict and disaster affected countries. We're looking at a variety of ways of delivering education, health and personal and social development education, that are described there. And we're looking at outputs, learning outputs that are really as realistic as we can make them, trying to look at, and this is not the work that the work group is going to be able to do, but there, as you've noted in the material, there will be further research through a research network that we've set up with the World Education Research Association, that the learning outputs that are achievable by the end of primary school or by the end of secondary school, they include those things showing on the screen, but they're not anticipated to be necessarily leading to what are often health behaviors or health outcomes or social behaviors. We're trying to be more measured, to look at, or more modest about what we should be talking about. If you look at the example of reading, schools are held accountable for ensuring that all students can read when they leave school, read and comprehend and use reading skills, but they're not responsible for the reading behaviors of those people as they go on in life. It's that kind of modest approach that we're encouraging rather than the optimal approach. And of course, there are different kinds of delivery mechanisms, and that's described in that last little bit. The next slide of the starting from the real world, one of the most important activities of the work group will be to try to, based on our experience, by the collective experience in the number of people in the work group and others, is really try to estimate how many hours of teaching and learning time actually exist in that context. And that may be a reality check for us, but I think it's important to start from that context. And then the next slide will be looking at the same kind of modest and realistic approach in looking at teacher capacity in teaching and learning about health, personal and social development learning. So we're going to be taking that kind of definition, and there are some experts in those different contexts that are going to help us there. And of course, Martin online is going to be one of those folks. And that's really going to this slide. What we're trying to do is understand the status quo. And so we have a number of organizations who are going to help do a bit of a fact-checking survey, as well as a analysis of the curriculum documents and the education policy documents from the countries around the world. And then we'll do the same for trying to understand how teacher education and development programs are delivered around the world. So that's really kind of our starting point, and maybe I'll stop there and ask if there are any comments, reactions to that, to the materials and to the first sort of conceptual overview that I've tried to provide. Just jump in, click on your mic, and say hello. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I think that you're trying to do a huge amount, Doug, which is all really really laudable. I think that we do need to be careful about biting off more than we can chew. And I think in terms of what you can achieve, it's helpful to start with thinking about the curriculum breadth that's going on. I think the teacher capacity question we need to approach carefully, but I think that you've got a really broad awareness of what's going on around the field. I'm interested in how we level up, if you like, what's going on at OECD with what's going on in Kenya or Zambia, where we found that the teachers actually want the same support and the same curricula and the same breadth and the same learning to happen, but they don't have the infrastructure to deliver.
Good. Thank you, Martin, and I agree. We'll come back to it. Further comments and questions, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. And did you maybe just go ahead, Jonathan? Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I mean, I thought it was it absolutely reflects, interestingly, our experience here, even though we're in a period in the UK of going through a big government consultation as to whether or not to make what we call here personal, social, health, economic education a mandatory part of the curriculum, and yet the issues around it being very much seen as sort of generally developed from a topic-based perspective, huge issues with teacher capacity, being very, very live issues within that consultation as well. So it's just interesting to see that reflected from a global perspective. And I think, to second what Martin was saying, really interesting to think about how do we, although we're obviously a high resource country, in the UK, we face a range of structural issues which I'd be interested to see what of the good practice we know here can be translated to other contexts, even where there's few resources, as an interesting question.
Thank you. Further comments or suggestions? Maybe just to finish up that thought about being careful about not biting off more than we can chew, and that's certainly a comment that's come in the emails that have been sent in response to the work plan and the overall project. And I agree fully. We're just to be clear, as a work group over the next year and a half, we're not going to solve this challenge. What we're hopefully going to be able to do in a variety of small bites is well, first of all, identify the reality on the ground in those three different contexts, and that's basically fact-finding and drawing out of the experience of people who have been working in those contexts to give a sense of what actually is happening and what is feasible from that base. And that's, although that sounds simple, it's actually going to be a lot of work to do that in a couple of sessions with several people involved. And then when we've got that sort of starting point of what actually does exist in terms of capacity, we'll take a look at some of the paradigms that are reflected in the work that everybody online and others are doing, be it in social emotional learning or in health literacy or in global citizenship. And our challenge there, our task there, is to really try to, first of all, understand how that concept applies and how it might be looked at in a very minimalist way, and perhaps develop some hypotheses about what that minimalist approach could be in the different contexts. And that's all we're going to be able to do, in my view. We're not going to be able to go on and test that minimalist hypothesis in terms of whether it has an impact on student outputs or can as a prerequisite for behavior change. But we'll be able to identify hopefully the kind of the core aspects of each of those concepts and perhaps how they can be aligned in different curriculum delivery structures. The research group that's being led by the World Education Research Association will then take up that task. We're hopefully going to be able to provide a bit of a set of specific advice about the different contexts, about the different issues, and then encourage researchers to explore that from a minimalist point of view rather than from an optimal point of view. The discussion of what actually does exist is going to be very helpful, I think, for the discussion around the UN goals, and what we need to be able to do there in a fairly urgent way, because they have to proceed. They are proceeding in looking at goals under goal number 4 and target 4.7 is how does health and wellness, or health and personal and social development education, fit into their plans, and are there data? Is there data that can be helpful to them? And I think our fact-finding exercises and our estimates and so on will be useful to them. But just, we're really trying to be, realistic about what we can achieve as a work group, and we're also trying to be realistic about the capacity of schools to respond. And it does take structures, it does take resources and structures and things in the real world that need to be in place in terms of improving that capacity. Any other further comments about sort of the conceptual basis we're working with? If not, taking a look at this slide, which is really an attempt to capture the different paradigms, I've used the word paradigms, that are being used to guide education in health and personal and social development. You can see the many different topics and the many different paradigms that are captured in those 3 bullet points. That's really an attempt to look at how these different concepts can be listed. And they could be listed and presented in a variety of other different ways too. It's not something that we need to, I don't think we need to look at too closely. And there may be other ideas and things that we want to bring into that. But that's really the kinds of concepts that are being thrown at schools in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different delivery structures. And maybe take a moment to see if there's anything that jumps off the page as being awkward or out of place, or better than the other parts of those words. But we're not going to try to wordsmith at this point. But Can people respond to that and see if those three titles or three subtitles that we've been using for this work group title helps to capture the amount and the complexity of the social role of the school in terms of what students need to learn. Any comments about that?
Just a very quick comment, Doug. I think that your three areas are all really sensible. I think that what you've got in life skills and social inclusion are positively framed. I would just warn against sort of negative framing around some of the things that are in there, such as, you know, exploitation, abuse and neglect and what have you. I'm not saying that you shouldn't cover them, but if you start on that, you can end up thinking that, you know, that we're approaching this from a negative angle, which I know you're not.
Okay, and that does take us back to our problem approach and filling up of the curriculum about in terms of trying to respond to that problem. Point taken. Further comments?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I was also thinking whether something like financial literacy or financial education is covered in any of these.
Try to a little bit, but it may need to be strengthened in this slide. Let's. I know it's definitely covered in other materials. If I've missed it, then we'll make sure it's in.
Yeah, but it does say economic exploitation. Maybe a more positive framing could be like economic empowerment or financial literacy.
Good. Yes. And certainly that's one of the variations on life skills that we'd like to take a closer look at. Two folks on the line today, both you and Jonathan, have got economic education or that kind of financial literacy kind of things that are often covered in health, personal, and social development curricula. So it's definitely there. We'll need to strengthen it. Further comments about that kind of listing?
I would just add, I mean, I think, again, I think it's a very sensible way of splitting those out. One of the debates that's sort of quite live here is about this differentiation between a knowledge-based curriculum and the development of skills, which is happening sort of in other areas of the curriculum around how, and there's a big drive in the UK to make the curriculum more knowledge-based in that sort of E.D. Hirsch model. Now, we've been trying to stay out of that debate, but I think, you know, when we're talking about it, developing, I suppose, ensuring young people can navigate or maintain and develop healthy, positive relationships, we'd be talking about some functional knowledge, but obviously the underpinning skills that support that as well. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that necessarily needs to be reflected in any of this, but just always mindful of the interrelationship between knowledge and skills and sort of personal attributes as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good point. And yeah, that was kind of what we were interpreting these words a bit in terms of the first bullet point is really literacy. A little bit. Health literacy is not focused just on knowledge, but it's we're trying to get that notion of knowledge in that first bullet, skills in the second, and attitudes in the third, because I think they're all important in learning. Attitudes and aptitudes and beliefs are often and are there as well. So it's and that kind of the challenge, of course, going back to knowledge, is that every issue, every problem does have some basic functional knowledge, not necessarily what's been promoted as being taught, but what is that students need to have about that issue in order to be ready to be able to learn the skills and attitudes and about that issue and about that general area. So it's a bit of a challenge, but the phrase we've been using is functional knowledge, because it's not all the knowledge that could be taught. General skills and specific skills, again, some specific skills or behaviors, strategies that are particular to a particular issue or particular area of learning. And then social inclusion in terms of the kinds of attitudes and aptitudes about themselves and about their communities. That's another kind of set of issues. Other comments about this slide, because it kind of captures our scopes out a little bit, our the scope of what we're trying to capture.
I'm thinking, this is Elke again from Aflatoon. I am wondering if gender is mentioned somewhere specifically. It could be mentioned here, or perhaps under like gender-sensitive teaching or somewhere else. But it's such a hot topic that I thought you might want to include it in your social inclusion more specifically.
Good point. Yes, it definitely will be. Thank you for that. We'll add that. Other points. The slide give you a bit of a sense of the scope of what we're looking at. It's interesting. I've been asked to serve as a bit of an advisor to an important group that's starting up at the UN Education Commission. If you're not familiar with that group, it's chaired by Gordon Brown and very senior people, and it reports directly to the UN about education. And Martin, you could tell us more about this, I think. But I've been asked to serve as an advisor to that group, where they're looking at what they're calling their Education Workforce Initiative, which is to try to develop the capacity of the education workforce, teachers, and not only teachers, but teachers primarily, to address all topics, not the one that we're doing, not just this subject, but all subjects. I was pleased to see that in their definition of what teachers are needed to teach about, they did combine, you're probably familiar with this, the 21st century learning skills model with a life skills model. And I noted that the life skills, the way it was presented, was from one particular base of knowledge in my comments, and you speak up and you get invited to do some work. But I thought this group, as we start our work, might take something from this page and give them a kind of a placeholder as to what kinds of paradigms and issues and big concepts need to be thought about in terms of the social role of the school, the socialization function of the school. And they would appreciate that advice. So if members of the group are interested, I'd like to try to take a stab at taking this page and expanding it a bit and writing a one-pager, which could not only clarify the scope of our work as a working group reporting back to FRESH, but also help be a bit of a placeholder for them. That's not their job. They're looking at the education workforce. They're not being asked to look at, what ought to be taught. They're looking at who teaches it and how can the workforce be developed. But they do want to start from a goals point of view. And so they would be interested in getting a kind of a page or two that looks something like this with these kinds of concepts. And I wondered if members of the group would be interested in doing that. We would draft something in the next little while, run it by the FRESH partners, since this is a working group of the FRESH partnership, and then give that into them as a bit of a placeholder for their discussions. And going back to Martin's earlier comment, they are interested in this because they're trying to balance out the breadth of the curriculum. They're trying to not just be always focused on science and math and technology. Are people interested in helping to do that kind of a one or two pager?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that, Doug. I think it's a good idea to give advice from groups such as this towards that area. I will raise the fact that there's a whole lot of people working on the same thing at the moment. We've got OECD 2030 in operation, which Elizabeth will know about, which is looking at curriculum breadth, and they've got a whole framework around social and emotional inclusion, and they take a knowledge, skills and attributes approach, looking at values as well. And there's the work we did with Brookings around breadth of learning, which you'll be aware of. That will be something that you can certainly link to, give people access to when you're doing that work, particularly in the developing world. There's a whole lot of work going on at UNESCO as well. There's a teacher task force which looks at similar area. David Edwards really is our contact for the Gordon Brown work, but you'll be well aware, Doug, with the number of places that you've been around the planet, that a lot of these things are happening in parallel. And I think the more that you can do to join up the dots across the different areas, the better it's going to be for all of us.
Thank you, Martin. And you're right; those sources are the kinds of things that we need to start from. And again, we're not going to be able to do the depth of work that those other organizations are doing, and nor should we try to. But it may be helpful to that particular group in giving them as I say, a placeholder for them to say, okay, these are the kinds of things that relate to the health and social development of students and their learning, and that's all they need, I think, for their purposes. And I think from our purposes, it will help to make sure we've captured everything in that comment. And I see Margaret's also offered to be involved in this contributing to this piece. So is there a general consensus that we'll try to do that? It would mean an email conversation. And actually, I was trying to figure out, whenever you put something in words like this or in bullet points, it starts to lose the multidimensional nature of it. So I thought we might even try to depict it in one of those messy word diagrams, where all the words are in a kind of a not an icon, but an infogram kind of thing, so that it doesn't try to sort it out in a permanent way. It doesn't. In that particular document that I'm responding to, that I responded to, it was in a grid, in a table, and that doesn't work either. So we might play with a visual like that, just to make sure all of the concepts are in there, but not try to resolve them in terms of the weighting and the nature of those groups, nature of those concepts. Okay, if people are comfortable with that, I'll then move on to the next slide, which is really kind of looking at, in each of those paradigms, what we're hoping to do. And again, emphasizing the word modest, we're thinking that the time element for the many different experts and other participants who will be invited to address each of these paradigms would be, we don't want to press our luck, but so thinking of doing a brief summary, 3 or 4 pages, with the key components or aspects of that paradigm, to describe how it's been used in guiding curricula in health, personal and social development curriculum, in other subjects and across the subjects, and in the delivery points the way we've been talking about earlier, to try to think about, to try to develop a starting hypothesis of the minimum student learning outputs, and they're described there as a prerequisite for behavioral change. Or if that's not feasible, to maybe outline a process to get to such a hypothesis. Again, try to be modest about what we can do, and then pass that over to the research group that I've talked about. And then also briefly describing the knowledge and beliefs and awareness of teachers and the school-based or schooling workers as needed. And that's there's a couple of people on the working group who have done reviews of the beliefs and awareness and research, systematic reviews of the research that's been done in those areas. So we'll start with a good starting point to try to do that task. Is that a good kind of a achievable work plan for each of the subgroups that will be of this process? That so we're thinking at least one web meeting, open web meeting, and development of a 3 or 4 page summary, and development of a hypothesis. Is that workable? Comments?
Dr. Doug, this is Yuka.
Yep.
Can
Yes.
I ask you one question? Because actually, we have a 3 contexts, but we also target for children. But I'm wondering, because depend on the age bracket, the expected life skills and also maybe knowledge and also the attitude will be different. So how you identify with regard to this age bracket or target age for children?
Yeah, we're trying to look at 2 endpoints: the end of primary schooling and the end of secondary schooling, as being what the students would have in terms of learning outputs when they graduate. So it wouldn't be age, wouldn't be a specific age, but we by the end of their primary or secondary schooling is the frame that we're trying to start with. That may be challenging in and of itself, but it kind of avoids the different educational structures around the world that have different ages in different types of schooling. There are different grades.
I'm not trying to spoil you.
Thank you. ありがとうございます。
Okay, thanks, Yuka. Other comments?
Thank you.
And there's, just to emphasize, reflect Martin's point, there's been a lot of work being done already. So if this work has been done already, and we'll hopefully find that through the people that have been involved in the various subgroups and in this work group overall, we'll use what they've already done. It was actually a really good learning experience for me to track down, as I was tracking down people for this work group, I was learning about their work, and so there's a lot of good work that's been done. The social emotional learning, the CASEL has the Collaborative on Academic and Social Emotional Learning has been doing a lot of work about measuring it. ACT has been doing a lot of work about measuring it as well, and also some of the softer skills soft skills in their work. So there's been a lot of work already done here. It's just a question of pulling it together as it exists and trying to summarize it, and then encouraging those groups to continue the work, or asking members of the research network to pick it up as a hypothesis or area for further investigation. Other comments about this sort of task description? Okay, I'm going to move to another aspect, and this is something we'll draw out of the other the different people on the working group, and it relates to the FRESH partnership, the FRESH framework. That as I was saying earlier, one of the first points is we suggest to countries that they need to focus their resources on issues that are most relevant to their students. And so as part of that advice, we've tried to develop some lists of topics that are more applicable to different contexts. And this one is a brief list of topics that are more likely to be relevant to low resource countries. And you can see that they're pretty well, it ends up being quite a long list, particularly if in resource strained context. It's challenging for schools to be teaching and students learning about all of these topics. So the advice of picking the issues that are most relevant and focusing resources on those applies even to this list. If you go to, and this is a scarier one, this is the number of, and you can look through the list. These are the number of problems that are asked of schools in high resource countries. It's quite endless, and so again, the advice of sorting out what needs to be done in different jurisdictions is paramount. So is that helpful in explaining the problem, and maybe also starting to get us to think about how these three different contexts could work? There is some good work that's been done on conflict and disaster-affected countries by a group called the Interagency Network on Education in Emergencies, and so we'll draw from them to look at that third context. Comments on that problem of too many issues, too little time?
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Doug. I think that one of the things that troubles me, and this is in the work generally, is that you end up with a hegemony between what happens in different countries. And I started with this, but I think it's teased out by those two pictures, that you've got this sort of post-material environment where you've got a whole lot of things that are being dealt with. But if you go to a developing country, it's not that they're dealing with any less, it's just that you've got a simpler list, because the ability and the space to respond to the number of issues that are coming up is less. So I think it would be good to do some thinking that doesn't sort of prioritize one set of things over another for countries automatically, that's something that happens with the country and alongside the practitioners. And I think putting teachers in that conversation is really going to help the issue. I also think that there are some things which happen everywhere, and bullying is a really good example. So how do you use the things that happen everywhere to open up the discussion in a way which gives teachers the ability to cover the whole breadth of the curriculum? It's a difficult problem, but I'm sure we've got a number of minds around the work who've got an idea about how we could unravel that one with a bit more equity, and I'm interested in pursuing that.
Good point. Good point. We shouldn't be grouping people and labeling countries as such. That's a good point. We'll have to find a way of doing that. At the same time, trying to be faithful to our notion that there is a finite capacity in the three different contexts that also needs to be considered. So it's you're right though. We need to think about not suggesting that countries in one context or another need to ignore those other issues, or that they will, because they'll address them if they find them to be relevant. Further comments?
I think just on that, one of the big questions for us is how do we support teachers to best design their curriculum for their school community and the young people that they're working with. So I think there's a question about what tools can you give teachers in different countries to best understand that list themselves. So to kind of second Martin's point that it's not, whilst there's going to be different levels of resource, not assuming that some countries aren't dealing with particular issues or that there are other issues that must be grappled with first, but putting that in the hands of teachers and schools to say, well, what does my community need? But I just to second as well, the issue of an ever-ending list of topics is one that's sort of front of mind of our Department of Education in thinking about whether to make PSHE compulsory in schools, and something they're very concerned about, and something we're trying to describe or best persuade them that there are ways of ensuring that teachers can deliver a curriculum that prepares children for life without it being an endless list of topics. I think it does come down to needs assessment of the pupils you're working with.
Great. I'm going to finish this conversation and invite Romain, who's just joined us to introduce himself. I think it's and join the conversation. And maybe what we need to add to this section is advice about how countries can help schools to make those local choices. Help schools or local authorities to make those choices. I think there's a tri-level approach to this that is probably necessary, that there probably needs to be a national set of priority issues. There probably then each community, as reflected in their local authorities, need to make other choices to elaborate on that or emphasize certain ones, and then each school needs to be responsive to the local community. And maybe we need to build into these lists some steps to encourage people to engage in that process to make those choices. Is that a way of resolving that, so we're not labeling these contexts? Okay, Romain, I see you're online. Can you just click on your mic and say hello? And
Yeah, hello there. Yeah, my name is Romain. I work for the Education and Solidarity Network, which is an international network of education unions, as well as non-for-profit healthcare insurers, so mainly mutual benefit societies. And yeah, I got the information that you were holding this meeting through Martin Henry from EI. EI is a founding member of our network. And yeah, I forgot to say that the topics dealt by our network as health and well-being of the education community, so teachers as well as kids, and social protection.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invitation. Happy to be with you.
Great. Further comments about helping countries manage a workable list of issues. Again, that we're trying to look at the notion of the capacity of the school systems to absorb these issues and to get away from the notion that, or the practice, and it is a practice, that in research and in program development and even in the funding provided to schools, to throw attention on specific problems rather than putting them together as best the countries can. Then I guess it's really starting to close up here in terms of the two important reasons for the work group, and it's really number one is the need to try to address this challenge in a modest way, particularly as we move to curriculum materials and learning materials being online. The coherence can be easily lost quite quickly, and again, and folks online are probably more familiar with this, the development of competency-based curriculum frameworks that look at overall learning goals across the curriculum and can also be less clear and provide less structure for local authorities and schools and teachers to follow. So that's the real challenge we're hoping to address. And then the policy opportunity is the UN goals, trying to help the UN agencies who are working on that to be able to address health and personal and social development learning better in a way that's more satisfactory than what they're doing now. And they are, and not to criticize, because they are working from the reality of what data does exist and what countries are doing in terms of collecting data. So a little bit of a summary in terms of hopefully what we'll achieve over the next 18 months or so. I did add that bullet with regard to the teacher workforce, the education workforce initiative of the UN Education Commission. I've noted as well our strategy of passing off the research issues to another group that are better equipped to deal with them in the longer term, and also the very many different research networks and initiatives that are already underway. There's not going to be any attempt to try to do something that somebody's already doing with, and so as we work together, hopefully we'll get a better idea of that, and maybe we can, as part of our report, we can map out what does exist in terms of the various initiatives and point people to them. And then the other follow-up group is we're going to be creating a network of education and other faculties concerned with health and personal and social development. One tool we'll be using is online tools, and so that will be another group that will be able to recommend follow-up, and that seems to be a very feasible thing to do as well. There's a lot of interest in creating that kind of network of education faculties and other faculties. So, further comments or questions in terms of as we finish up this this evening, this morning?
Yeah, I have a question, and maybe I'm not well informed about this, but I'm just wondering, are you also taking the lead on the International Research Network at the World Education Research Association, or is that someone else, or is that two different groups, or is there an overlap between the two groups?
A bit of an overlap. The proposal we made was ISHN, our International School Health Network, was part of the proposal that was made to the World Education Research Association. Dan Leitch who will be liaising with this group, is the primary lead on that, and the executive director of that association is also going to be involved in this group. But it's hopefully going to be another set of people who are going to be working on those research issues. There may be some overlap between some of the individuals who are dealing with this kind of policy program kind of advice, but it's going to be a different network, as will the Teacher Education and Development Network be. And as an example, Margaret has already pointed out in one of her posts in the instant message box that Margaret's been involved in a lot of work on online teacher development, and so that's another angle that we're going to try to promote. But again, it will not be part of this working group. Our task is to develop a series of summaries and then to put it all together into a report some 12 to 18 months from now, after we've done the series of specific sessions.
Okay, great. Thank you. And yeah, feel free to sort of pass by reports if you need reviews.
Excellent.
As you've mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you. There's just an incredible. It's just so pleased if we just go back to that list, and I couldn't get them all on the page, but it's been so heartening to see the response to the number of people who are willing to work on this in a timely way, and as it relates to their work, not trying to bring everybody together in yet another group, but rather to learn from each other in a series of specific sessions. So I've been really pleased, and you can see the breadth and depth of the group, and that's only about 60% of the names. I stopped when I ended up without space on that slide. But it's really, really very heartening to do this. So further comments, and you all have my email address. We'll be working on that doodle to provide a list of all the contacts, so you can go back to that. It'll be up to date as people join. And in each area, on each topic, we'll be asking your advice about who else should be involved in that particular conversation in an open web meeting, and be happy to take that advice and do the legwork in terms of inviting people to the sessions. Just generally speaking, and I'll send out a list of people who are involved with contact information, so you can touch base with them if needed. And then also, generally speaking, we'll be convening these open web meetings in the first week of each month, roughly speaking. It will depend on individual schedules, which is going to be a joy to try to organize, but it'll be generally in the first week of each month that we'll have one meeting about this project. And everybody's welcome to attend all of them, but we are asking you and relying on you to take the lead on the sessions that you are interested in already working on. So that would be great. And we're going to be able to invite others to join us. They'll be open so that people who are interested can come in and learn and listen, and then participate, give us their advice. It's an open process. Further comments and questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time today, and we look forward to further discussion as we move forward. So watch for email. It'll be an email-based conversation in many, many respects. Thanks again.
Yeah, Doug, sorry, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Romain speaking. I was wondering what are the links with this, because we heard of this project of UNESCO Chair on health and education.
Yes.
And so is there, are some links foreseen or cooperation or collaboration between our working group and this upcoming project?
Could be. I'll have to explore that. I just learned of that the group just recently, so I'll be happy to follow up on that.
Okay. We can also provide information.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Further comments or suggestions? But that taking up that point, if there are other groups that you think or individuals who you think should be involved, please send them to me in an email, and I'd be happy to follow up. Okay, well then thank you again for your time, and we'll look forward to our next steps together. Thank you again.
Thanks, Doug.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Doug. Bye-bye.